Well, thank you everyone again for joining and welcome to the virtual relaunch of our signature event series, Research on Tap. I'm Casey Schoenberger, Vice President of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. At Equitable Growth, our goal is to advance evidence-backed ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broadly shared growth. Over the last several years, Research on Tap has served as a gathering place for those in the Equitable Growth community to connect over drinks and discuss how to create strong connections between the latest economic research and policymaking decisions. Though we can't be together in person today, connection remains vital. So we're pleased to partner with the Groundwork Collaborative to bring this event to you virtually. We believe that starting with how resources are distributed allows us to push to the fore questions of economic and political power. We look at all the ways inequality could affect the pathways to equitable growth, from obstructing people from getting the skills they need, to subverting democratic accountability and the market's mechanisms themselves, to distorting demand in terms of both consumption and investment. And that's why Equitable Growth's institutional strategy begins with engaging the academic community. We fund and support a growing network of established academics and promising early career researchers. And I'm proud to say that over the past 7 years, we've awarded more than $7 million to over 250 scholars across the country. We also seek to make that evidence accessible to the policymaking community, as well as to bring scholars and policymakers together so that they may better inform each other's work. As our nation faces the triple crises of a public health crisis, economic crises, and ongoing racial injustices, we're focusing today's conversation on the evidence-backed policies and ideas needed to invest in a more equitable future. Research and common sense tells us that declining public investment is damaging to US communities and our economy as older infrastructure depreciates and economic and social challenges go unaddressed. This decades of disinvestment in infrastructure and in people has led to the further concentration of wealth at the top, contributes to widespread economic instability, and perpetuates racial and gender inequities. But when we look to the evidence, we can see that the tools exist to support a sustained recovery, build a strong US economy, and address underlying structural issues. But the private sector alone is not capable of making the large-scale investments we need. And fortunately, a growing body of research provides a framework for how the federal government can address the overlapping structural challenges currently facing this country, including the climate crisis, the lack of 21st century care infrastructure, and structural racism and discrimination against Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. If designed correctly, this wide range of infrastructure investments can address longstanding racial and income inequality. It can drive clean energy, support work, create good jobs, improve worker productivity, reduce economic uncertainty, and truly jumpstart a new era of innovation. This afternoon, we brought together leading experts to discuss evidence-backed policies and ideas that ensure the United States can emerge from the coronavirus recession stronger, more resilient, and more equitable. We have an opportunity now to address the long overdue public investments in physical and care infrastructure, to boost economic growth and productivity, to put the United States on a path in which that growth is truly strong, stable, and broadly shared. For today's event, we're going to begin with a one-on-one conversation between Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Cecilia Rouse, and Washington Post reporter Tracy Jan on how making these increased investments can build towards a more equitable future. Then we're going to turn it over to the panel conversation, which will focus on strategic investments to spur structural change, moderated by Equitable Growth's own Amanda Fisher, and featuring Jupa Bhattacharya from the Incite Center for Community Economic Development, Joel Gamble from the National Economic Council, and Saleh Omaroma from Cornell University School of Law. And just a few notes before we get started. This event is on the record. It's being live streamed and recorded. We do encourage you all to join the conversation on social media using hashtag #ResearchOnTap. And we, of course, want to hear from you. So we'll be featuring a Q&A for the last 15 minutes of the panel conversation. We encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the chat box. And we do ask that you please include your name and affiliation, and if you are directing your questions to a specific panelist, please include that too. And before we begin, I always want to recognize my colleagues at Equitable Growth, especially our communications and external relations team, who put in a huge amount of work to make this event happen today. And then of course, I want to thank the team at Groundwork Collaborative, who are always such excellent partners and co-hosts today for helping to make this event a success. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay Owens, Interim Executive Director at the Groundwork Collaborative, to introduce the one-on-one conversation. Lindsay?
Thanks so much, Casey, and to the full team at Equitable Growth. Groundwork is thrilled to be partnering with you today on this event, and Equitable Growth is really just an extraordinary partner for the Groundwork Collaborative. Lindsay Owens, Interim Executive Director at the Groundwork Collaborative. Our mission is to advance a progressive economic worldview that helps us to move beyond the debunked neoliberal ideas of our past and embrace a simple truth that we are the economy. That is, workers, families, and communities make up the economy, not just corporations or fictional job creators. The COVID recession has made clear that the economy cannot be strong while people are struggling. That's more widely resonant now because we see the truth in every facet of this public health and economic crisis. It also means that we can't have a true economic recovery while some are left behind. So as Casey mentioned, this is really especially true for communities that have been marginalized in our economic policies, people of color, women, low-paid workers, and other vulnerable groups. That's made us more susceptible to crises, and it's also slowed our recovery in the past. So I'm so excited to introduce the participants for today's one-on-one conversation. Both of our guests really understand the mistakes of the past and the lasting impact that unchecked inequality and race and gender disparities have had on our economy and on marginalized groups. Most importantly, they both understand the truly rare opportunities of the current moment to make structural change and to build an economy that works for everyone in order to truly achieve a full recovery. To preserve time for the conversation, I'll share only the recent of their many, many impressive accomplishments. But first, I'm really delighted to introduce the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Cecilia Rouse. Her confirmation by the Senate last month made her the first Black leader of the CEA in its 75-year history. In this role, she serves as the president's chief economist and a member of the cabinet. And she previously served in both the Obama and Clinton administrations and has been a professor and dean at Princeton, among a number of impressive roles. But I should say that I first discovered Chair Rouse during my doctoral work in graduate school, where I read her really seminal paper on hiring in symphony orchestras, which was really instrumental to my research and just had such an ingenious design. It was just really an incredible body of work. So thank you so much, Chair Rouse, for joining us today. And then I would also love to introduce Tracy Jan, who covers the intersection of race and the economy at the Washington Post, a beat she herself launched in 2016, which encompasses racial economic disparities, immigration, housing policy, and other areas. She previously was a Washington-based national political reporter for the Boston Globe and has a number of impressive journalistic accolades throughout her career. I'm very pleased to welcome both Chair Rouse and Tracy Jan. Thank you.
Terrific. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for having us. Chair Rouse, I wish we really were doing this over drinks.
Oh, I was thinking the same thing. Research on tap in the middle of the day just somehow doesn't quite get it, but it's a pleasure to be here.
I was hoping we could start. I know we don't have a lot of time here. We have a lot to talk about, and I would just love for the audience to hear a little bit about your personal biography and how you decided to go into this field of economics.
Sure, sure. I've been very public about it. So I come from a family that has always very much valued the power of education for advancement, also for personal enrichment. But my father, I think, was the first, we're not entirely sure, not that we've done all the research, but we believe he's the first African-American to get a PhD in physics from Caltech. My mother was a school psychologist and had a couple of master's degrees, including an MSW. And so I very much appreciated the technical side and the value of math and some of that analytical rigor from my dad. But from my mom, I very much was interested in social problems and trying to find ways to make the world a better place. And that sounds Pollyanna-ish, but that's truly what I wanted to do. So I went off to college and I was, casting around what to take. And my mom says, well, I think you should take a class in economics. And at that time, economics was not taught in high school. This was back, 200 years ago. And so I enrolled in Ec 10, which was the introductory course. And the first semester was micro, which is what I do now. I will just flag, but the first course was micro, supply and demand, prices, in the second semester, we did unemployment, and we approached it from the macroeconomic perspective. But what I really appreciated about that is it broke down the different reasons why workers have become unemployed, why we would have higher levels of unemployment. And this was in the early 80s when we had just come off of a period of very high unemployment. And so I could see in the classroom, models and thinking that could help me understand and think about phenomena that were happening in the real world. And from that point on, I was hooked. And so I then went on to take a class in labor economics, and I became a research assistant to an assistant professor at the time named David Bloom. And through that, I did research for a senior thesis, and that's where it was born. I really liked the way that economics helps us to break down and understand the world. I don't believe that economics is the end of the road in terms of understanding what to do, but I think it provides a very useful framework for scoping out what are the important questions to be asking. I think economists get really good training in data use and analyzing data. And so I just think it brings a whole host of skills that are useful for addressing the most important social problems of our day.
Well, we'll be talking about analyzing data some more this afternoon. With your appointment came the hope in some quarters that a labor economist such as yourself would help swing economic policy from favoring corporations towards workers. Now, would that be Pollyanna-ish of folks to believe?
So I am one member of a team, and our team has a quarterback, and that quarterback is President Joe Biden. And our president is the person who very much believes that believes in workers, be nurturing our workers. We have to be valuing our workers, making our economic system work for workers if we are going to, really compete going forward. That he believes that's part of the source of our growing social inequality, and we will actually lose out in the world going forward if we don't really bolster our middle class and our families. So I'm proud to be a member of that team. It's not lost on many people that at the CEA, one of the members is Heather Boucher, former president of the Center for Equitable Growth, also a labor economist, and Jared Bernstein, who, he wears many hats, but fundamentally is also very devoted to labor. So I think that starting with our quarterback and the entire team, it really does reflect the value that this administration places on workers, on the labor market, and in trying to rebalance how our economic policymaking is going forward, and we want to do it in a way that's beneficial to the economy. We all believe in economic growth, but we believe that growth should be shared. And we also believe we can be doing a lot better if we make sure that everybody is on the field, so to speak. I think this analogy is going too far.
You're a tennis woman, right?
I'm more into tennis, and we only have a few people on the court at a time, but we need everybody there.
That's right. Well, let's talk about this moment that we're in. So we're recovering from this pandemic-induced recession. Many white-collar workers are saving more money. They're ready to splurge on, vacations when that becomes a thing again, home renovations, while millions more Americans have lost their jobs and are at risk of losing their homes. With Black and Hispanic women being hit the hardest. So can we talk about the recovery, what the recovery looks like? And does the Great Recession offer any comparisons, or is that not the right parallel?
So I get nervous when we start to draw parallels between this economic crisis and the Great Recession. The Great Recession was caused by a problem in our financial market. It had a true economic source. It was a traditionally caused recession in that sense. Every recession is a little different from one another, but nonetheless, it was caused by an economic problem.
Mm-hmm.
This recession was caused by a public health emergency. It was caused by a pandemic. The economy was humming along. We can talk about how well it was humming along, but unemployment was 3.5% by all general metrics, and that's part of our problem. And I think the panel will be discussing this going forward. But if we look on average, the economy was doing quite well. We would not have called ourselves as being in an economic problem before the pandemic hit. The reason we're in economic crisis is because the way that we could get through this health crisis relatively safely. I'm hesitating because we have lost more than 500,000, of our fellow Americans. But to get through this relatively safely, we had to basically, power down the economy. And so the reason why then I hesitate in terms of the analogies is because the Great Recession, we needed to recover in parts of our economic system. This time, when we get past the pandemic, the bones were there. And so not that we're going to completely snap back, because I think we've lost in some places where we're going to have to actually rebuild, but fundamentally we'll be able to come back more quickly. The employment growth last month, which was 900,000 jobs in 1 month were added. That's an example of the speed with which we may be able to come through this recession in a way that we weren't able to come through the Great Recession.
Is it
I can
possible?
talk about how we want to do better, but
that's my next question.
That's where I get worried about it. Yes.
Is it possible that we could possibly emerge better, stronger, more equitable, especially given the pervasive economic inequality that existed baseline, even when we were doing well?
Right. So there was inequality at baseline. It was exacerbated by the pandemic. I was just reading in the Wall Street Journal today about how individuals with subprime car loans have fallen through the cracks of the immense amount of rescue aid we've put into this economy. We've done student loan forbearance. We've put, we've paused mortgages, but car loans and other personal loans, people are still required to pay. They have to negotiate with their banks. And so there's a looming crisis there. And if we think about our student loan forbearance and the mortgage assistance, those are student loans, people who went to college have student loans, people who own houses have mortgages. Many of these people who have car loans are relying on those cars to get to work if they have work available. And it's a completely different situation. So, on many dimensions, this crisis has, as you mentioned, for many of us, it was what I would call an inconvenience. I can't go out to eat as much as I would like to, as I would have. I couldn't go on vacation. I've saved, so I'll be able to do that eventually. And for others, it's been completely devastating. So the American Rescue Plan certainly understood that and has at its bones. That's what the direct payment was about. That's what the extension and expansion of the child tax credit was about. Was about saying that we recognize that there are those who have really been harmed by this pandemic, and we believe that you need some assistance. We are committed to keeping in place some of that assistance for the lowest wage workers, those who are the least advantaged in our society. So that is one respect. Improving our safety net, I think, is one way in which we as a society will come out of this better, because let's face it, everybody's at risk of hard times at some point. And as a society, we should be able to do right by people. But importantly, we are committed, as we're coming out of this, to ensuring that the investments that we're making are widely shared. So when we think about the infrastructure investments, for example, as part of the American Jobs Plan, a group at Georgetown University has estimated that the bulk of those jobs would be filled by people who do not have a college degree. And so those are blue collar jobs. Those are largely workers who are of color. And so we know that if we are aggressive and mindful about where we make those investments and the types of jobs that come with them, and at the same time providing the kinds of training so that workers who currently have the skills that they need to take advantage of these jobs can get them, that we can be investing in the workforce at the same time that we're investing in these in our economy and the economic infrastructure.
Well, even when Black unemployment was at historic lows before, when our economy was humming along, people were cobbling together multiple low-wage jobs, often without benefits, to make ends meet. And it was still nearly twice that of white unemployment. So is there a different way to measure the health of our economy? Should there be a better way, given you have Jared Bernstein and Janelle Jones talking about targeting the Black unemployment rate? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think we should be looking at many sectors and not just looking at, say, the average unemployment rate. And it's interesting that you talked about people having multiple jobs. They're not counted as unemployed, right? They have jobs. Right. So, right, you had the Black unemployment rate is twice that, and yet you still had people who were quote unquote employed who were struggling to make ends meet. So I do think we need to be mindful of the economic health of different parts of our economy and of our workforce. I believe also that part of the reason why, in terms of these further investments, it's not just about having more jobs, it's about having better jobs. So many people have said, oh, the $400 billion that are being proposed for the home care workers or the home care sector, that's not really infrastructure. Well, I beg to differ, right? I can't go to work if I don't have someone who's taking care of my parents or my children. And we know that our society is aging. We're going to have more people who are of retirement age, or who, you know, the proportion of our population that's over the age of 85 will be growing by a third over the next decade or so. So we need people to be taking care of our elders, to whom we are greatly indebted. And yet that workforce, which is largely female and women of color, is really poorly paid. And so as part of this 400 billion, what we're proposing is that they work together through organizations which can ensure that they are paid better, that they have better quality jobs, and that there is good evidence that when these workers are paid better, they give, not only is their life better, but they actually provide better care for their clients, for those who they are serving. So yes, we want to try to have not just any old job through these investments, but we're looking for the high value added jobs, those jobs that actually will pay well and provide better job security and economic security for the workers.
Along that vein, the data vein, what do you think can best improve our statistical capabilities to better understand whether public investment in the American Rescue Plan or any upcoming infrastructure package are reaching all Americans?
Right. So there's much work to be done on this front. Our statistical agencies have not been invested in over many years. This even precedes the last administration. So I'm sure your panelists will have many great ideas. I'm a labor economist. I think about areas such as the Current Population Survey or the American Community Survey. And I think just one place to start, we can talk about adding different questions, but even just adequate sample sizes so that we can do reliable studies of these subgroups. So African Americans, certainly, especially among certain surveys, but I want to put a shout out for our Native populations. The American Community Survey, this is hard. There aren't a lot of Native Americans who are on reservations. Many Native Americans are out in the community, but their numbers are small in relation to the population. But it's very difficult to do any reliable analysis of what their labor markets outcomes are, what their living situations are, because the sample sizes just aren't large enough. That requires an investment. And at the CEA, we're trying to work with the chief economists at different agencies to be adding into the budget, what do you need in order to increase the sample sizes of your various surveys so that we can even just do some of the basic descriptive analysis of the data you're already collecting by subgroup. But there's much more that one could be doing. Trust me, that's just the first step.
Even with the Asian American population, which is such a diverse diaspora, exactly. The numbers don't tell the full picture at all. It's the group with the widest income disparities, inequality, but we don't know the extent of it because of all the different subgroups.
I will agree with you. And if you're a student of the CEA blog every month for the employment report, what you will notice is that the Asian American unemployment rate bounces around. And some of that is because of the small sample sizes. Yeah. And so, right, we need to, if we're going to understand what is happening, we need to have adequate numbers of people who are surveyed. But that requires resources. Let's not pretend this is easy. it requires commitment on the part of our government and our statistical agencies to put resources into that kind of data collection.
Right. The president's job plan, if the pandemic had never happened, is there still a need for that investment? The pandemic is a good rallying cry for it, but these inequalities existed prior. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Look, not only is there a need for the jobs plan, and in a few weeks we'll be rolling out the families plan as well. So not only was there a need to be addressing these kinds of inequalities even before the pandemic, but fundamentally what these plans are about is reinvesting in our research and development, which we know is a foundation of growth. R&D as a percentage of GDP in this country had fallen by a third. It's a third now compared to what it was in 1960. So it had fallen rather dramatically over the last 50 years. If we look at what we've been spending on infrastructure, that has fallen by over a half over the last 50 years. If we look at what we invest in our workforce compared to our other advanced economies, we're like dead last. So we have not been making the kind of investment that we know we need to be making if we're going to really keep up and ensure that our economy is poised to remain number one in the world, the largest economy in the world, and positioned to take advantage of new technologies and to address some of the bigger issues such as climate change. Climate is the classic public good. We're breathing air. We're dealing with the warming climate, and any one person or any one company, the private sector in general, does not have a huge incentive to address it fully. Yes, there's some incentive to make some investments here, but because this affects everybody and we can't exclude everybody, we all benefit when the climate is better. We all are losers when it's going south. That is a classic place where the federal government and where governments have to step in. So we know that these kinds of investments are needed if we're just going to remain competitive. The president also really, really believes, and he said this at his press conference, that this is a test for democracies. We know that there are these big challenges that are facing us coming forward. And can a democratically organized country get it together to make the kinds of investments that we need to make in order to be prepared to address these problems? Or do you need to go more top down, such as China? And I think that's one way to think about the race with China is who is better positioned to make the kind of investments that we have to be making in order to remain competitive.
Well, this is a wonderful conversation. I wish we could continue this. Are there any last closing words you'd like to say?
Yeah, which is that, look, this is a moment. People keep saying, so what's different? We know that, as Casey mentioned at the top, we've got the pandemic, we've got an economic crisis, we have a racial equity, which has been blown open. We've got climate crisis. We are really got multiple almost existential crises that we're facing at one time. And importantly, we have a president who has the will and the really at his core, the desire to make big investments to try to address them. So it's going to take all hands on deck. I don't think there's one way to address them all. But I think we all need to be putting our hats on and saying, how do we do this in a way that we effectively make investments to ensure that our economy continues to grow, to ensure that that growth is widely shared, and that we have the revenues to pay for all of this, which we didn't talk about, and that we're all fairly contributing to what are really public goods and are all contributing to this national effort. So we
could talk about the revenue part if you want to. The lack of revenue.
Yeah, well, that's part of the problem, right? We've really been relying on this private sector model and not putting any value on the public sector. And yet I think that the private market, I believe in that, but it can't solve all problems. And so there's a really important role for government in solving these problems. And governments need revenues to do that. And we should all be contributing to the revenue base so that our governments have what they need in order to really make this a functioning, thriving economy and society.
Thank you, Chair Rouse.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
All right, thank you to our first panel. Thank you, Chair Rouse, for that discussion and for Tracy Jan for facilitating. I'm Amanda Fisher. I am the Policy Director at Equitable Growth. Thank you all for joining us today. We have a lot to live up to for this next discussion, but I'm confident that our panelists will have some great insights. In this discussion, we're going to continue the focus on the need for increasing investments in public institutions, not only to get past the pandemic, but to address the structural inequities that made us so vulnerable to the coronavirus and the recession it created. Our panelists here today agree that this moment offers policymakers a once-in-a-generation shot to invest in care infrastructure, because we know that issues impacting caregivers, individuals, and families are not individual problems best solved by individual solutions. In physical infrastructure, to address decades of underinvestment, as well as a climate crisis that's already bearing down on us, and structural racism, which sits at the intersection of these issues and others. To underscore the importance of this conversation and the immense opportunity for policymakers, Equitable Growth is today releasing a letter signed by more than 200 economists from across the country, calling on Congress in the next spending package to make robust and sustained investment in physical and care infrastructure, along with science and technology, to solve the problems of the 21st century. Led by economists from UC Berkeley, Princeton, Howard, and the Ohio State University, the letter argues that now is the time for government investment that can spur strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth. So without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists and ask them to join me now by turning on their cameras. Their full bios are up at our event page, and I encourage everyone to check it out because they have all accomplished more things than I can possibly cover in the short amount of time that we have. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce first Jupa Bhattacharya from the Incite Center for Community Economic Development. Jupa is an experienced organizer and thought leader on economic policy issues, particularly those affecting people of color, low-income communities, and immigrants. Next up, we have Joelle Gamble, who is the Special Assistant to the President for Economic Policy at the National Economic Council. Joelle has a long history of working on issues related to inequality in the economy. She's no stranger to equitable growth and many folks on this call, and we are lucky to have her advising the highest levels of policymaking in the country. And last but not least, we have Saleh Omarova from the Cornell University School of Law. Saleh has produced some of the most forward-thinking scholarship on financial regulation and how it intersects with investments in the real economy. So before I jump into the discussion, I'd like to just clarify a few housekeeping items. First, we encourage everyone to join the conversation on Twitter. The hashtag we're using is #ResearchOnTap. Again, that's #ResearchOnTap. So join in there. We also want to hear from you. This panel has a Q&A at the end. The last 15 minutes are reserved for your questions, so please submit them using the Q&A feature in the chat box. Our team behind the scenes is collecting them, so even if it doesn't pop up, we'll do our best to grab them and answer them in the remaining time. And when you do submit a question, please include your name and your affiliation so we can directly address you. So with that being said, I want to jump straight into our panel. And my first question is for Joelle. And following on Chair Rouse's discussion, I'd really like to hear your take at a 50,000-foot level to frame out the moment that you see us in right now. How would you characterize the economy? Are we in recovery? Are we not quite there yet? And what additional supports are needed, not just to get us past the pandemic, but to start to address the structural changes that are needed to build a more equitable economy?
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Equitable Growth team, and thank you for my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation. We're in a really important inflection point. As Chair Rouse mentioned, in the latest jobs report, we saw about 916,000 new jobs, but we're still down about 4 million compared to February 2020, which is, the kind of agreed upon benchmark of when the pandemic-induced economic crisis began. There are some bright spots here. We did see gains in sectors where women are overrepresented. So hospitality, leisure, public and private education. But there still are persistent racial disparities in our unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate for Black workers fell, but it fell to 9.6%, whereas for white workers, it's at 5.4%. For Asian American workers, it was at 6%. And so there are still lots of folks who do not yet have jobs. There's still persistent issues of employment for communities of color. And we're still quite not back to baseline yet. More importantly, I know a number of people have been talking about how this is kind of like a female recession, and that there have been gender-specific harms that have happened. And so, we know that we've hit a 30-year low at the heart of the crisis for the share of women who are participating in the labor market. We were out more than 12 million jobs held by women when the pandemic initially started. There's still like 4.6 million that are still out of work who were originally employed at the start of this. And at the same time, when we are seeing hourly wage gains for some workers, in March, hourly wage gains actually fell a little bit because we were seeing job gains in lower wage sectors like leisure and hospitality, which gets to the point that this is a K-shaped recession and that there are still jobs that were low wage before that need to be better quality jobs today. As Chair Rouse said, we care about creating jobs. We also care about the quality of those jobs, which leads me to ask the question, was February 2020 actually the baseline we want to get back to? Is that sufficient for saying we have an equitable economy and that we have an equitable recovery? I would say no, but there's been a disconnect for decades between wage growth and productivity growth, in part because workers today are older and better educated. You would expect there to be higher wage growth as a result of that. There are more women and workers of color and immigrants who are making up a larger share of the workforce, but they are in jobs that are lower wage, lower quality. On top of that, there's been a shift in the workforce from manufacturing sectors to service sectors, which also means out of unionized workplaces to non-unionized workplaces, and also regional shifts of workers that are all leading to that disconnect. And then on top of that, we still have a productivity problem where there are a number of reasons as to why this exists, but one thing I want to highlight is rising market concentration. And so you're seeing, as Tomas Philippon and Hermes Gutierrez noted in their paper, there's higher market concentration, but it's leading to less productive investment, higher prices in a lot of industries, and lower productivity growth. So we're not quite there yet. There's a lot of other things that I can talk about that are structurally wrong, from the union density issues that we see today, where we're not quite where we were mid-century, to the fact that we're behind. We're 13th in the world for infrastructure investments. We've lost a quarter of our small and medium-sized manufacturers in the last 30 years. But that just all sounds doom and gloom. I will say that there is a way to start to move towards an equitable recovery. The White House and President Biden has a plan, the American Jobs Plan. Don't need to get into my full pitch for that today, but there's a lot of work to be done in making sure this economy is structural, which means we have to think broadly about what it means to actually do an economic recovery. It means we have to think broadly what it means to invest in infrastructure, and broadly about what communities who have been perennially underinvested in this country, people of color, women, tribal communities, need to be able to be a part of ongoing economic growth.
Thank you so much, Joelle. I feel like each sub-bullet that you discussed could be its own, 45-minute panel discussion. You covered a really broad history of economic policy in the United States. I want to give our other panelists an opportunity to jump in after that framing. So, Jupa, I'd love for you to either react to any of Joelle's opening remarks and your insights on how you view the economy right now. And then I'd really love for you to address why care is infrastructure and why it's important to think of it as such. I have seen a real surge in articles and podcasts in the last week trying to debate whether or not care is infrastructure. And I think you're really well positioned to kind of give the facts on why we should think of care as infrastructure.
So thank you for having me. It's an absolute honor to be a part of this all-female amazing panel. This is phenomenal. So I agree 100% with everything that Joelle said, not to anyone's surprise probably. And the only thing I would add in terms of where I feel like the economy is right now, I think the economy is on the struggle bus because people are on the struggle bus, right? I think my friends, the folks that I know, my family members are still really worried about keeping a roof over their head. There are people, yes, mortgage and rent have been stalled for a minute, but what's going to happen when all of those bills come and collectors come to collect a year's worth of mortgage and rent, which people simply don't have, right? So yes, things are getting better, and I hate to be the voice of doom and gloom, but we are nowhere near where we need to be, and the economy is on the struggle bus because people are on the struggle, and we are the economy, right? So to get to your second question around care, I love this question. I'm going to get a little more comfortable. So when we think about the word infrastructure, right, what do we think about? We think about kind of the things that we need to uphold a healthy, a sustainable society and economy, right? So we normally think about things like roads, we think about public transportation, we think about utilities, we think about internet, like things that you need to be kind of functioning in society. And we have traditionally divorced care from the conversation about infrastructure and the conversation around public goods, right? Because it's been seen as women's work. We'll just somehow figure out how to take care of all of it. Like, we don't have to think about that, right? So what is that done? What does that mean? So we at the Incite Center, every few years, we put out a report called The Cost of Being Californian, which looks at what does it actually cost to live in California by county and by different types of family types. So if you have 2 children, an infant, a preschooler, if you're a single mom or dad, working families, if you're in joint families, we kind of calculate all of that for you. So we're about to release our 2021 update to the cost of being Californian. And what we found is between 2014 and 2021, the cost of childcare in San Francisco County raised by 81%. 81%, right? In LA, it's 45%. And in Fresno, which is like the Central Valley of California, for those that are unfamiliar, which is considered a more, affordable place to live, it's risen by 35%. So what does this mean? Now, childcare is overtaking or is on par with housing costs, right? Because we have no public infrastructure. We don't consider it a public good. We rely on the private sector mostly to take care of our children and our elderly folks. So what that looks like on the ground is if you are lucky enough to have a job or an employer that pays you well enough to be able to afford this 81% jump in childcare costs, right? That's taking up more than a third of household budgets. You are allowed to live a dignified, stress-free life, right? But if you don't, if you're not lucky enough to have that, if you're working a minimum wage job or even a middle wage job, it is really, really hard to show up at work and be present and be able to kind of do what you need to do, constantly stressing about childcare, right? I was on this struggle bus a few years ago, right? It is really, really hard. Childcare is enormously expensive because we have no public infrastructure to back it up, right? So this is absolutely a worker power issue. It is a worker rights issue. It is not just a female issue. It is a societal issue that we have to be paying attention to. It is also a racial justice issue because we know decades, centuries of policymaking, right? And elected officials have made choices that have led to enormous gaps and inequities around wealth and income based on race and gender, right? So who is it that are working in jobs, or who is it that can afford these large increases in childcare? It's women of color, it's people of color, it's families of color, it's Black and brown families. So when we're talking about creating an equitable infrastructure, an equitable economy or society, we have to bring care into the conversation and consider it a public good.
Thank you so much for that overview. I want to jump to Saleh and talk about physical infrastructure, but before I do that, Joelle, did you have any reactions on the why care is infrastructure piece and why it was important to highlight that within this suite of packages from the administration?
I think what Jupa is saying is absolutely right, that care is infrastructure. We included it in the American Jobs Plan for that reason, that if you want to talk about folks, being able to go to work, you're talking about actually other people's jobs. You're talking about folks who take care of children, folks who take care of older parents, folks who take care of folks with disabilities, et cetera. And so, the $400 billion proposed investment in the American Jobs Plan is designed to make a really big advance in terms of how we're supporting care work as critical to how the economy works, as critical to how we think about infrastructure and how we think about, broad-based economic growth.
Thanks so much for that. We could talk about the care infrastructure piece for this entire panel, but I want to make sure that we get to Saleh. So physical infrastructure is one area where the United States actually previously excelled, it could be argued, though people of color were historically excluded from the benefits of that investment. And we see that long shadow still cast over our economy today. But in recent decades, America has really fallen behind with the erosion of domestic infrastructure and our industrial capacity. So I think you come at this from a really interesting place because your scholarship for much of your career was focused on how financial institutions either were or were not channeling our resources into productive investments. And recently you've become more focused on how to finance infrastructure to address the physical needs across communities in the United States. So can you kind of, from your perspective, zoom out and discuss why the public sector and not just Wall Street is needed to jumpstart our infrastructure investments that can narrow inequality?
Yes, thank you so much, Amanda. I was really happy to listen to both Joel and Jupa, especially talking about these structural imbalances in our economy, in our society, really, right? We all know how bad things are, and we all know how enormous the challenges are that we're facing. As Amanda said, my scholarship was initially focused on the financial system, and I was worried about financial stability and financial risks and how to prevent financial crisis. What I found throughout my research was that you cannot divorce that question, the structural imbalances in the financial system, from the broader structural imbalances in the economy, precisely what you guys were talking about. The two are just the two sides of the same coin. And by the same token, right, when we talk about the economic recovery, when we're talking about how we can counter market concentration, privatization of economy, financialization of economy, how we can talk about, how we can correct structural imbalances, geographic, regional, social, racial, whatnot, we really need to focus more specifically and concretely on how we can change the financial system. Because the financial system is that key link that basically connects the big plans that our President Biden, I'm a big fan of his plan, American Jobs Plan, right, puts out on the one hand, and what actually will happen in the years to come. Will those people that we care about the most actually get the benefits of these great plans and great investments? What we need to focus on is the structure of the financial system, those channels that basically allocate capital to specific uses. So we've had for many, many years this hybrid financial system where it's basically a public-private partnership. And the private actors, private financial institutions, private investors, private companies, they're the ones who get to decide how to allocate financial flows. They choose whom to lend, they choose what securities to issue, and so on and so forth. And the government, the public, basically backs up that system. It controls the background conditions, like, for example, preventing inflation, making sure there is maximum employment or whatever level of employment we can achieve, that there is healthy population, infrastructure, public goods, police force, I don't know, all of these things, right? So it's in the background, it sort of supports, and it comes in and cleans up the mess when private actors sort of blow up the system, right? And it has to control, discipline private markets. And that system was working more or less until maybe 40, 50 years ago when it started falling apart for a variety of reasons. And effectively, what now we have on our hands is Wall Street, the financial sector, is not really allocating financial flows. It's not allocating money to productive economic enterprise. It doesn't care all that much about what actual companies in real economy are getting, right? Instead, they would rather channel incredible amounts of private capital into speculative trading. They'd rather invest in Bitcoin futures than in something that benefits poor people somewhere in the suburbs of Californian metropolises, right? And the government, on the other hand, it has been gradually and quite dramatically exiting from controlling the background economic conditions. The government has internalized that ideology that the government is inefficient, corrupt, it's an illegitimate economic actor. And it stopped controlling and disciplining the flow of finance into where the government needs it to go, where we all need it to go. And without that public perspective constantly guiding private markets, what we have right now is our government basically lost its institutional muscle as an economic actor. And now we're living through the results of it because private actors only pursue private profits, right? They don't have that view of the economy as a whole. It's not their job. We need to invest in clean transit lines, in affordable housing, in clean energy, water facilities, particularly in disadvantaged communities. But those are not the communities where private investors want to go because they're not lucrative. We need public actors, the ones with long time horizons, focus on public benefit, and huge resources, all of our public resources, to go and channel finance into those areas. And the question here is that, do we have an institutional actor? Do we have an institutional platform that could manage that process? Because it's not just about committing trillions of dollars of public money to building certain things, right? It's about who is going to control and manage the building process, because that will determine who will own those infrastructures 10 years from now, 20 years from now.
That was a great overview. I encourage folks to read Saleh's National Infrastructure Authority proposal that really explores a lot of these issues, both the need for investment and the governance issues more fully. And the reason I love Saleh's scholarship is because she really gets at the root causes of some of these underlying fragilities that have made our economy so fragile in the face of the coronavirus. And I kind of want to take that frame and go back to Jupa and ask you, you have closely followed the narratives that have underpinned some of this systemic disinvestment from care infrastructure in particular. We now see care workers make, I think, a median wage of $12 an hour. A large portion of them live in poverty. So I'd love to hear from you about what narratives have taken hold that have led to the social and monetary devaluing of care that we see now.
It's a great question. So, we often think about the economy as like it's its own kind of living organism that like makes its own decision. Oh, the economy is doing this, the economy is doing that. When in reality, here's the secret. It's people making decisions that drive the economy, right? Like the economy is not a thing on its own. Like there are folks, mostly white men, that are making decisions that decide, right? That indicate what we value and what we don't value. Right? And narratives, and when I'm saying the word narratives, I'm talking about kind of our cultural frames, or the mental models, right? That we are, we live under just by virtue of like living and growing up in the United States, right? So an example of a narrative is this idea that anyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? That is a huge American narrative. It's completely false, but that is something that we live under, right? So our narratives also impact the economic decisions that are being made, right? They impact what types of economic policies get passed, what don't, and what we value and what we don't. And again, like we really have to grapple with, and I think, and reckon with the fact that the narratives that we hold in America are directly a descendant from white supremacist and patriarchal viewpoints, right? So what does that mean? It means things like care work, which has traditionally been seen as women's work, is devalued because men don't care about it or think about it as much as women have, right? Because it's just like this thing, right? So there's a reason why construction work, which is kind of considered a man's work, right, pays so much better than care work. The skill sets are different, but they're equal in the sense that it takes a lot of skill. If anyone is a parent or if anyone has ever had to take care of a child, like it is not easy. And there is a lot of skill that goes behind having to take care of young people and older people that are in need of help, right? Like not everyone can do it, but we think of it that way, right? Like it's no big deal. Oh, anyone can babysit or anyone can teach a child. Education is another really great example of this. Like we devalue this work because it is seen as women's work and specifically Black women's work. So historically, within the United States, we have relegated Black women. First, it was by forced labor. Then it was, well, no, we will pay you very meanly, right? Not much, to watch our children. And that underpins what, why the care work is so devalued and why today in 2012, or sorry, we're not in 2012, we're in 2021. I can't believe it. We devalue care work so much because it is traditionally seen as Black women's work. And if we don't come to a reckoning with that, we're never going to be able to get out of this cycle, right? It is absolutely a truth that we need to hold dear. I get that it makes people really uncomfortable, but if we're not naming that and we're not addressing that, then any policy that we put out there in its implementation will continue to devalue Black women and Black women's contribution into the economy.
Thanks for that. And as I was doing, some reading over the last week or two preparing for this panel, I noticed that a lot of my research since the pandemic has been around small business owners and entrepreneurship. And it's interesting how many care providers are actually small business owners or entrepreneurs, but their stories are not kind of wrapped into that common understanding of who is an entrepreneur in America, which your narrative framing really reminded me of that. And also how there's been a childcare crisis in this country for decades. And it's really only now, unfortunately, with the pandemic where issues in that space have spread across more and more families that it's finally getting the attention it deserves. But
well, it's getting the attention because men have to deal with it now, right? Because men were forced to be at home with their children having to work and juggle it. So now it's getting the attention. So who's in power matters, right?
Absolutely. And to kind of map onto a similar set of issues that Saleh, you look at, physical infrastructure is seen as being more racially neutral, I guess, sometimes in our common narratives, but we know that urban renewal has been used to gut Black communities. The interstate highway system was built in large part to enable white flight, and private capital flows are definitely not race neutral in terms of where they go. So when you talk about your NIA and the needs you've identified, particularly in communities of color, how can a reinvigorated public role that has proper governance address some of those structural inequities?
Well, that's a big question, Amanda. But thank you for that question. Well, it's absolutely true that in America, unfortunately, pretty much all economic and environmental problems are deeply racialized. And that's the sad and really terrible kind of historic legacy we still live with. It's mostly communities of color and disadvantaged communities, poor communities who also live in highly polluted areas without any basic social amenities, without transit lines, and without jobs. And that's the key to it, right? So in order to address the problems that communities of color and other poor communities face, we need a strong public institution that would basically step into the financial markets and start acting within those financial markets, competing with Wall Street, competing with those types of investors that channel capital away from disadvantaged communities, away from job creation in the United States toward speculative activities and various other things, but do it in a kind of sort of thoughtful and comprehensive and programmatic way. So the National Investment Authority is one option. I've been advocating it for a while now. It's sort of, I envision it as a third leg of the stool, three-legged stool of public finances, if you will, alongside our Treasury, which is our fiscal authority, and the Federal Reserve, which is our central bank. And the mission of the NIA would be to design and implement a comprehensive national investment strategy in that space between traditional fiscal and monetary policies, something that we currently don't do. So the NIA would basically have an independent, democratically accountable governing board. Think about it as kind of an analog to the Federal Reserve Board, right? But it would actually look at the structure of the national economy and identify precisely those imbalances that Joel talked about and Jupa talked about, right? Which regions need more investment, which sectors need more investment, which communities need more support, and how we can channel into that. But the NIA would also have operating subsidiaries, the special government corporations that would be acting directly in financial markets, both in credit markets, kind of like Fannie Mae does, or European Investment Bank does, for example, by lending, guaranteeing, making markets, and so on and so forth, but also acting separately in equity markets, being sort of like a publicly owned BlackRock, an asset management firm, a public venture capital fund. And that's the novel element that I feel very strongly about. So what the NIA would do, it would change the dynamics within financial markets. It would actually allow a lot of institutional investors, because not all institutional investors out there with a lot of money are actually some kind of bad Wall Street wolves. Most of those institutional investors actually represent us when we put our money in 401k in our retirement savings funds. That's the money that feeds Wall Street. And the NIA would set up, for example, public-private venture capital funds and would invite pension funds, endowments, public banks, other sort of mission-driven institutional investors, take their money and then manage that money to channel into the buildings of the kind of infrastructures that take a long time to build, therefore are not lucrative enough, not attractive enough for private investors, and yet are also beyond the limits of current public authorities to fund. And that's how the NIA would act directly in financial markets and yet be guided by this sort of public policy, public investment strategy, and help both the Treasury and the Fed to basically guide us toward a better future.
Thank you, Saleh. And I think you really underscore why new public institutions and new small d democratic ways of allocating our shared capital are really needed in this moment. Joelle, you've been quiet for a little bit of time, so I want to make sure that you can jump in. But we've had some great big picture thinking from Jupa and Saleh on kind of the way forward. I want you to frame out for us kind of your view on next steps. So the American Rescue Plan was just signed into law. The president just announced the American Jobs Act. The Families Plan is coming soon. Chair Rouse touched on this a little bit, but earlier in this discussion, but what research-based lessons from the last crisis do you think have been internalized to kind of shape the administration's policy response today?
Great. Yes. Sorry, I've been quiet. It's because my Zoom is flashing a notification saying it's not responding, which is another point that broadband is infrastructure. So just let me know if for some reason I cut off, which would be, somewhat ironic. So a few, and I wanted to also just quickly jump in on Sal's point about the importance of being able to crowd in private investment. We often talk about public sector investment and the government's role in investing in, frankly, frontier technologies, or if we're talking about small, medium-sized manufacturers who are not, appealing enough to the private market alone. We often talk about that as somehow crowding out private investment, but there are opportunities for actually public capital actually de-risk opportunities for the private sector. And so it's not even an either or situation. It's actually, I think, really important to US competitiveness. To answer your question directly though, there are a few lessons that I think are worth elevating that we learned from the financial crisis in 2008 and the recovery back then that are guiding how we're thinking about the recovery moving forward and are backed by a lot of the analysis of how the recovery went after the Great Recession. One, there is a clear risk of going too small. And I would say that clear risk has real ramifications for people, including scarring effects on a lot of folks who suffer unemployment or prolonged unemployment with a slow recovery. I would say that equity in recovery is also not guaranteed. And if anything, if you're not thinking actively about equity, you can actually risk exacerbating inequality, both in thinking about specific programmatic design, but also thinking a lot about the role of sustained periods of high employment and starting to close some of those perpetual gaps in unemployment rate by race that I was talking about at the start of this panel. I think another lesson learned is that if we're really focused on regaining US competitiveness, not just getting back to baseline, which you heard the president talk a lot about when he unveiled the American Jobs Plan last Wednesday, we also need to think about what some of the transformational projects are in terms of our infrastructure, not just what the shovel-ready ones are. I'm not saying that shovel-ready ones are not important, but instead we have to think about what the long-term vision is here. And then finally, we have to actively invest in good paying, quality union jobs. But we need to think about labor standards and protections as we think about the recovery, or else we could risk just an upward distribution of resources once again. And so you'll see in the American Jobs Plan, that's why the PRO Act is mentioned. Union density is important for giving workers a voice. It's also important for making sure that the gains of the recovery are shared in wages and compensation, et cetera. And that we also need to make sure we're extending those rights to industries and sectors that do not have it. I know we've been talking a lot about care. That's so important that we have, quality jobs in the care economy too. And so I think that those are a number of the lessons that we've learned from the last recovery to make sure.
I think maybe we lost Joelle. but we'll wait for her to get logged back on. I think she was concluding those remarks anyway. But Jupa and Saleh, do you have any reactions to the proposals that are currently in front of policymakers? If you were advising them, as you are advising them, what would you tell them to bear in mind?
Man, I wish I could have a magic wand and like make them do what I want them to do. So what I would say is this plan is a phenomenal, great start. And you know, it's a down payment to the larger needs, right? It is an incredible first step, but it in no way is going to solve this. The scale of the problem is so big that we need much more bigger solutions, right? And we just can't be afraid to do that in this moment. We have a real moment in history right now, right? To truly build back better, right? Like to truly live up to the campaign slogan. Because as we've talked about in this panel from the get, right? Like our baseline, like, you know, we talk about recovery, and oftentimes when we think about recovery, it's like, well, someone was somewhere, they got sick, like if you think about a body, right? And then we want to get them back to where they were, but where our baseline was so unhealthy. And so I think any economy that has such vast stratification on wealth and income and just the ability to meet basic needs on race and gender is not a healthy economy. And so I think we have a moment right now to dream and bring our dreams to actualization of a different type of society, right? Like this is a space where we can start talking about shared prosperity, really, and design an economic structure that allows for shared prosperity, right? We can understand that we are all interconnected to one another and like do away with toxic individualism and just understand that we are here for one another. In so many ways, the pandemic has done that. Like Americans do come out for one another. They really do, right? Now we need our infrastructure and our economic rules and narratives to match that, to match the will of the people, right? And so if we continue, if we get so worried about overheating, which is like not a thing, read Stephanie Kelton's book and you'll understand it's not a thing. And then what we're doing is actually proactively, not just being reactive as we've been in the pandemic, constantly reacting to really bad things that are happening. If we're proactive in this moment and dream up and create an infrastructure and an economy that really is equitable and helps our most marginalized, which is Black women, which is Indigenous communities, right? Those have them traditionally been put to the margins. We bring them to the center, that will lift everyone up and we will live in a better space. We will live in a better society. And I think that's our task right now. That's what we need to do.
And it looks like Joelle has joined us again. We were just getting reactions to some of the proposals that are before policymakers right now. Saleh, I want to give you a chance to jump in. I know that you do advise policymakers. And what would you be telling them to keep in mind right now?
Well, you know me, Amanda. I'm a professor through and through, and I always focus on the shortcomings first, right? So I would express my main concern being that I think there is that temptation to kind of get carried away with the notion of, let's just appropriate a lot of money and, announce all these big plans. And that's extremely important, extremely important. But the needs that we have to meet are not just like a one-time expense kind of an item. We need an ongoing, strong institutional platform that would continuously implement the kinds of policies on the national scale that we need. And so I think the other half of the solution that the policymakers really need to focus, and my hope is that the Biden administration really takes that to heart, is thinking about who will control the flow of all those trillions of dollars. Because my fear is that Wall Street will come in and just line up right at the tap, and Wall Street will be on every side of every deal and basically will channel the money to their benefit, to its benefit, not to our benefit. So I'm hoping that the institutional solutions are being thought about very carefully and very seriously.
That is a great point. And I would be remiss if I did not make a plug for Equitable Growth's work in automatic stabilizers, which is basically the same notion that one-time investments in these critical programs are great, but we do need to kind of address problems at their root and change structures for how we respond to crises, so that we're not starting from scratch every time they come, and we have the kind of scaffolding needed to make sure that that everyone in our economy and our infrastructure is supported at all times, and not just when we have these sort of cataclysmic crises, which unfortunately have been getting more frequent, but still it's not adequate to only address things then. I want to make another plug for folks to use the Q&A box to send questions to the panelists in our remaining time. I want to do a lightning round or two and then turn to the Q&A. Also, if you submit a question, make sure that you identify yourself with your name and your affiliation. So lightning round to maybe close us out. What would you like folks listening to this discussion to take away if you had to give them one point to leave behind? And we'll start with Joelle, who I think is back with us and has secure broadband now.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, the first thing I'd say is pass the American Jobs Plan. We should pass the American Families Plan. But also that we have to think broadly about what it means to do recovery work and to actively think about how to do it inclusively. Inclusion is not guaranteed. I think the American Jobs Plan does a really good job of trying to make sure that our investments are getting to the communities that have been perennially left behind, whether it's through deindustrialization, structural racism, et cetera. And so make sure that we're correcting historic inequities while also building towards a stronger state of economic growth.
Excellent. Jupa, what's your one takeaway for people listening to the discussion?
Dream big. Now is the time to do it. And if we don't, we're just going to be honestly in the same boat 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And is that what you want? Like, this is the time to really push and dream big. And don't let anyone tell you you're being a Pollyanna in the sky, because quite frankly, people were saying that to me and to folks at the Incite Center a year ago, and everything that we talked about, or 2 years ago, everything that we talked about and we're saying is now coming true, right? And we're in a moment where we can talk about race explicitly, we can talk about the patriarchy explicitly, and we need to. So let's dream big and push and organize and really think about power.
Excellent. And Saleh?
We need to rebuild the public investment muscle, and we need a national investment authority. That's it.
Excellent. So we do have some questions from the audience that have been submitted. You can keep submitting them. First off is a question for Saleh, and the questioner did not leave their name or affiliation, but they ask you, can you describe the regulatory or legislative paths we need to establish or reestablish so that public institutions can execute the massive infrastructure projects we envision? And are there specific examples from the past that we can think about? Now, luckily, we are with someone who has thought about the history of public infrastructure investments, and I think has a lot of corollaries there. So, Saleh?
Well, the closest example in the US history was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, that was set up slightly before New Deal, but actually came into its full strength during the New Deal. RFC basically became the capital bank for the New Deal, and it helped to revitalize the US economy during the Great Depression. And we still have a lot of remnants of the RFC, all the subsidiaries like Fannie Mae was a subsidiary, Exim Bank and SBA and so on and so forth. But we do need to think even bigger than that, because we need to adapt that example to the needs of our country today. The examples, there are some examples, there are a lot of examples actually abroad in Europe and in Asia, especially in East Asia, where there are strong states with strong export-based economies. But again, we need to think about the conditions in our country and adapt the proposals to our country. And what, I think that the only path for the NIA was something like that to become reality is Congress. Congress needs to act.
Excellent. Next up, we have a question that's not directed to any of the panelists, but I'm happy to jump in if no one feels comfortable talking about it. But Anna Aurelio from the Economic Security Project asks if anyone can speak more about automatic stabilizers. 21 senators just sent a letter to the president asking him to include expanded UI and direct payments tied to economic conditions in the next recovery package, this would incorporate the lessons learned over the past year and not leave people at the mercy of Congress to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table during tough times.
I mean, I feel like the question kind of answered itself. I mean, automatic stabilizers do exactly that. And Amanda, feel free to jump in, but it's this idea that we don't have to wait for a stagnated Congress, right, to act, if that's the case that's happening in at the Hill, that we have mechanisms in place that are like, oh, hey, people are suffering, so we need to do something. If the government is actually governing for the people, by the people, right? And so automatic stabilizers, I think, is a kind of a wonky term that people don't realize, but what it is, it's like a fail-safe, right? It's ensuring that people don't go hungry, waiting for politicians to act, right? And it's ensuring that people continue to have a roof over their heads. It's ensuring that people have peace of mind in times of an emergency. It's really that simple.
Absolutely. And as someone who's worked on monetary policy in Congress or looked at the CARES Act and the provisions that were authorized to kind of unlock the Fed's ability to do this emergency lending, we know that these ways of dispatching money very quickly on short order that kind of short circuit Congress exist. And we just think that they need to exist for working people through UI and direct payments and the other programs identified in our recession ready volume, which discussed automatic stabilizers back in 2019. So another question, this probably will go to Jupa, but others should feel free to jump in as well. Clearly data and evidence are not enough to incite systemic change. How do we shift deep-seated narratives around work hard and you will succeed? And this is from Georgia Gillen from Institute for the Future.
Thank you, Georgia, for that question. So data is important, right? Data tells the story, tells the truth, right? And it can feel really hard when we look at data, particularly economic data in America, because the story is not pretty, right? But it's just part of the solution. There has to be truth and there has to be reconciliation. So data without story, right? Data without understanding why the data is can actually be really harmful, right? So I'll take a look at, we do a lot of work around kind of mass incarceration. So, you know, people tout the statistic all the time in terms of the incarceration rate for Black men. Yes, we need to know that. We need to know that information and we need to know why. Because what will happen if we don't tell the story behind why, and it's because communities of color are over-surveilled and targeted by the police, then a narrative, because we are immersed again into anti-Black narratives just by virtue of living in America, then the story becomes, well, they did something, they deserve to be there, right? But that's not the case. So I think data is really important. We have to pair data with history and the story and the understanding of why things are the way they are. There's a reason why our history books only tell one side of the story, right? It's because we don't want folks to focus on the systemic. We want folks to focus on individual behavior, but our problems are deeply, deeply systemic. So, I mean, everything that, you know, messaging and narrative folks will tell you is that humanizing the population is really, really important because we've done such a good job of devaluing and dehumanizing, particularly Black and brown people in this country. So putting out a bunch of statistics does not humanize people. Putting out statistics that then tell the actual story and the lived experiences of folks on the ground goes a longer way to humanize the issue. And I think will help shift the Overton motive, like we're seeing happening right now, right?
Excellent. Yeah, and as someone who's, you know, worked in Congress, I really think that 1-2 punch of the data and the evidence is needed, but then you need to make it personal. You need to make lawmakers see and feel the people that these policies would help. So pairing those two together, I think, is essential to actually affecting the change that we want to see. I have a question now from Casey Schaenenberger of Equitable Growth. And Joelle, I'd love for you to jump in and just kind of talk about how equity and recovery is not something guaranteed. It's something that we need to affirmatively strive for. So from our perspective as Equitable Growth, what research questions can academics be taking on now to evaluate whether or not all people share in the benefits of the recovery equitably, particularly as we've enacted these few first packages?
Great. Can you hear me all right? Wonderful. That's a great question. And as I've been saying, equity is not guaranteed. And there's, of course, more we can learn to understand about the ways in which, the situations folks are in this economic crisis affects longer term inequality or exacerbates inequality. Two things come to mind that I think would be helpful research questions. One is the role of debt for households in exacerbating the economic recovery or the economic crisis, and then also hampering their ability to recover quickly. If there's any differentiation there, and differentiating by debt type, so medical debt, mortgage debt, or even being behind on your rent, as Jupa alluded to, which is just essentially like a foregone larger payment you're going to have to make once the moratorium ends. And then also, of course, student debt. And I think it'd be helpful to understand the ways in which debt has really hurt households in this crisis, whether it's differently by different types of debt, et cetera. And then the other piece would be around market concentration, especially since this is a pandemic that affected where people could move and could not move. And so you see folks not being able to access more Main Street businesses, online retailers thriving, but I still think there's more to learn about how that affects some of the longer run makeup of especially retail and other industries, where there was this kind of shift towards more online purchases, more contactless purchases. And so I think those are two places that would be really fruitful areas for research.
That is, Saleh, jump in too.
I just wanted to add something as a legal scholar, as a lawyer here, that one other thing that we need to think about when we're talking about research questions is the fact that research in this area isn't just limited to traditional economics research that is based on quantitative data and analysis and whatnot. We also need to build stronger bridges in terms of research between economics and other disciplines, legal scholarship, sociology, political science, history, and whatnot, so that we can actually weave in the normative type of research questions into the traditional economic questions. And the example that Joel, you brought up with market concentration is a perfect example of that, right? Because the reason why we have this concentrated economy is because certain normative decisions, certain policy decisions have been made previously based on various assumptions. And we need to go back and reconsider those assumptions. What is efficiency? Economists should start asking questions, well, for whom is it efficient? And if it's efficient for one group, but not so efficient for another group, how do we choose which efficiency wins, right? And those are deeply normative questions. And we need to find ways to build that conversation across those disciplinary borders.
That is music to my ears at Equitable Growth, Saleh. And Joelle, your points are well taken too. We do have a number of proposals that we're looking at this year that answer some of those research questions that you mentioned. So hopefully we'll have more soon. I have a great question from someone in state policymaking. It's from Mara Hennigan from the Office of the Cook County Board President, Tony Preckwinkle. And a question for anyone on the panel. Do you have any recommendations for state or local government leaders to keep in mind as they implement or look at federal legislation like the American Rescue Plan?
Well, I feel like a one-trick pony here, for which I apologize. But I think that what state and local authorities, legislators, and policymakers should really push for is the creation of that strong federal public investment arm, that agency that would actually have their backs as well and be that source of patient capital that would help all the state, local, tribal, municipal, and other institutions to really finance the kind of, put the money to the uses that they really need to put it to. So that would be my pitch.
I can jump in here. Joel, you go first.
It's okay. I would add two things. One, just kind of building off of the public investment point. The American Rescue Plan, for instance, injected more money, kind of revived the state small business credit initiative. And that's an opportunity, I think, for a lot of the local and regional knowledge and where there are real investment opportunities, especially in businesses that just are not seen at the federal level by federal agency programs, can be made. and that's the kind of infrastructure that I think is important in the long run for the recovery as well, is thinking about where we can build, more regional economic development and do so in a way that's inclusive. And I think that that's something that state and local governments are going to be way better at than the federal government could ever be. And so I think using some of that federal relief to also build up the capacity to then channel more investments to regions of growth and do so equitably is really, really important one. I actually combined both of my points into one, so I'll actually pass it to Jupa.
I was going to piggyback on what you were saying in terms of local governments, local municipalities know best what's happening in their communities, right? And if you bring an equitable lens and you're centering race and gender in how you're implementing the policies that are coming from the federal level, that is the best thing that you can do. And only you know what your communities need. So partner with local community organizing groups, partner with folks at the table, bring folks onto the table that are experiencing this from the lived experience perspective. I think that will go a really, really long way. The other thing that local governments have the power over is debt, right? Particularly around mass incarceration. So criminal legal fines and fees, right, is something that is controlled at the local and state level. So if we're seeing an influx of money coming into communities, particularly into Black and Brown communities, but that's just being taken away through unjust, quite frankly, racist fines and fees that have been implemented into the criminal justice system or legal system, these communities are going to be no better off than before. So follow California's example. We eliminated criminal administrative fees, 23 of them last year. We're going for the rest, all 90 this year, and I think we'll get there. But look at fines and fees in particular, because that is something that you have control over, and we need to start eliminating government-sponsored debt.
That is an excellent way to cap off this discussion. We're at 4:30. Unfortunately, we could not get to all of the Q&A submitted by listeners, but I think we covered a lot of ground. So I'd really like to thank everyone who attended today. I'd like to thank our panelists, and I'd also like to thank the Equitable Growth External Relations and Communication staff that made this Zoom happen. They are doing so many things behind the scenes to make sure that we all look good, and I appreciate that so much. I'd also like to thank our partners at the Groundwork Collaborative for helping to facilitate this event. And as we've heard from the speakers today, declining public investment has been harmful to individuals and families and to our shared economic growth. It's exacerbated racial disparities. But the good news is policymakers have the tools and the evidence they need to change this. It's just a matter of making different decisions. So before we sign off, a reminder to keep an eye out for future Equitable Growth events. On April 21st, we ask you to join us for Equitable Growth presents, our signature lecture series for a conversation with leading researchers about dispelling myths about poverty and boosting income supports. Thank you all.